Okay, well, the entries into our presentation are slowing down, so I will go ahead and welcome you to the Citizen Science event of the evening. This is by the Luckiamute Watershed Council. My name is Suzanne Teller. I'm the outreach coordinator for the Luckiamute Watershed Council. With us tonight is Kendra Callahan. She's outreach assistant, and she's going to be helping us with the Q&A portion of the presentation. And of course, our presenter, Stephen Dow Beckham, who are very honored and thankful to have with us tonight. I'll introduce him more fully in a little bit. In the meantime, let me end the poll here. Most of you have participated. Thank you so much. It looks like about 62% of you are watching from just on your own tonight, and we have another 16 of you that are sharing your screen with another, and even one that's 3 people watching at the same time. So we do have more than 45 people. I'm not going to do the math. That'll take too long, but thank you all for joining us. Okay, so this first I'm going to get started with a little housekeeping. We are going to have all microphones and video turned off for the presentation, except for, of course, for our speaker and me and Kendra. You will be able to ask questions and interact via the chat and the Q&A, but please reserve all questions for Stephen using the Q&A. We will have all questions answered by Stephen at the end of the presentation, but feel free to type them in as you think of them so that you don't miss out or forget your question, as we go further along the presentation. The chat is mainly for technical support. If you're having any issues or trouble, you can type in the chat and we'll try to resolve those kind of issues. But again, please use Q&A for all questions regarding the presentation. And so tonight's presentation is logging the Luckiamute, ramifications of splash dams and log drives. As I've said before, I'm with the Luckiamute Watershed Council, and we work in the Luckiamute and Ash Creek watersheds with a variety of stakeholders, including community partners, organizations, schools, agencies, and landowners of all types to protect, restore, and enhance the rivers and lands of both the Luckiamute and the Ash Creek watersheds. You'll see a map a little bit later in Stephen's presentation. So in addition to this on-the-ground restoration we do and monitoring programs, we also work to build stronger connections between people and place. Our Love Your Watershed program, which is the events portion of our Watershed Council outreach, it works to build opportunities to learn more about our local rivers, landscapes, plants, animals, and human communities, as well as how we can take action to protect and restore their health. For 2021, last year, and for this year, 2022, our theme for the Love Your Watershed program is exploring the history of our watershed. So tonight, we're highlighting the history of logging in and around the Luckiamute watershed and the contributions and impacts that this had on the forests and streams of our region today. Before I turn it over to Stephen, I would also like to acknowledge the first peoples of our watershed, the Kalapuya, who have lived here for over 14,000 years. Their stories involve thousands of years of knowledge and relationships with the land, the injustice and hardships of being forcibly removed from their homelands in 1855, as well as their ongoing resilience, engagement, and contributions as part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians. We look forward to continuing to shine a light on the past, present, and future of our relationships with the land and its waterways, as well as with the diverse communities of people that call this land home. So I'm now going to introduce our speaker for the evening, Stephen Dow Beckham. Stephen is a Pamplin Professor of History Emeritus at Lewis and Clark College. He has authored numerous books, helped develop many museums and exhibits there, has achieved a long list of honors, recognition, and awards, including the Oregon Professor of the Year, the Asher Distinguished Teaching Award, and the Earl A. Chiles Award for contributions to the understanding of the high desert interior of the American West. Believe me when I say that a full introduction would take up a lot of time. So I'll end with this. We are honored and thrilled that you're here with us tonight, Stephen, and sharing your knowledge, your research, and your experiences with us. And I'll let you take that from there.
Thank you. The little arrow has disappeared. Oh, there it is. Okay, it's back. All right. Thank you very much, Suzanne and Kendra. It's great to be with members of the Watershed Council this evening. The watershed of the Luckiamute is an interesting, circuitous run from the headwaters of the river in the Coast Range down to the floor of the Willamette Valley and it's the river's confluence with the Willamette. The primary stream is approximately 61 miles in length, and I'm sure that some of you know that route quite well, either through travel, fishing, recreation, hiking, or living in the watershed. The earliest representation of it cartographically was made in 1851 by George Gibbs, a Harvard Law School graduate who was secretary to the Willamette Valley Treaty Council that met at Champoeg in April and May of that year. Gibbs and Starling, his compatriot, drew an interesting 7-foot-long manuscript map of the Willamette Valley, and that map shows Luckiamute River, Kings Valley, the Chambers donation land claim, and the proposed reservation for the Luckiamute tribe just upstream from Simpson's Ferry on the lower reaches of the Luckiamute. This reservation never happened because the Senate of the United States declined to ratify the treaty of 1851. Instead, the politicians insisted that the Indians be moved east of the Cascade Mountains. That eventually did not occur either. Okay, there. Not much is known about the Luckiamute, excepting the identity by name of 5 of their villages, 3 of them on the Luckiamute, 1 of them near the river, and 1 south of the stream. This portrait of a Kalapuya man appeared in a volume published in London in 1848 called The Types of Mankind by Pickering. The Luckiamute were removed in 1855-56 to the Grand Ronde Reservation at the head of the South Fork of the Yamhill River. The census of November 25, 1856 identified 22 members of the Luckiamute band under a chief called John. That, of course, is an assigned name by the Indian agent, but this documents the presence and the long residency of the Luckiamute peoples right down to the present as members of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. The Luckiamute was in natural timber country. The Coast Range of Oregon had outstanding, verdant, abundant timber, particularly conifers, spruce, fir, hemlock, cedar, and yew being the dominant species. It was perhaps only logical that eventually when Euro-American settlers would pour into this region, that there would be an effort to fell those trees. The efforts involved the logging of gigantic old growth forests, and that in the 19th century was hand labor. Felling trees was hard work, and these men in this view have the basic tools. They used a springboard in a notch in the tree to get up off the ground and out of the brush so that they could freely use their axe or crosscut saw to fell the giant tree. And then once it was down, they used a bucking saw to remove the limbs and cut it into sections, and eventually peaveys to turn it. This view is of the Cox brothers, John and Glenn Cox, who grew up on Mill Creek, a tributary of the South Yam Hill, where their parents established a donation land claim in 1845, about 4 miles east of the Grand Ronde Reservation. Their tools include the springboards that they're standing on, an axe on the right, and a long crosscut saw that was used for felling or bringing down the tree. Once a tree was down, it needed to be cut into sections, and that was also done by the use of a buck saw, hand sawing through these massive trunks of a tree in a tangled jungle of downed limbs and tree trunks. Turning the log was quite an art, and Joseph Peavy of the Penobscot River in Maine in 1857 patented a tool called a peavey for prying and turning. It had a handle and a sharp blade, and then a pivotal hook that could be used to latch onto the log and using brute force to turn it. Transportation of logs involved finding heavy labor, and the heavy labor that was initially used were ox teams. Ox team logging via a skid road. The bumpy logs that are laid down across this path were the means for getting the timber out of the woods. So here we see several span of oxen yoked to logs that are being dragged down a hillside. And in this view, there is a man with a bucket of grease and a dauber who greases the skids of the skid road so that the logs will move in a little bit more slippery fashion forward as the ox team pulls them. The goal, of course, is to get the timber out of the woods to a sawmill. The Luckiamute became the setting of log drives starting in 1853 and continuing at least until 1938. Henry Van Pier's sawmill at Hoskins at River Mile 38.6 was established in the early 1850s. The Franz brothers succeeded by 1866 with the mill at Hoskins. Then came the Simpson brothers in the 1880s, and with Prescott and A.J. Van Ness, they engaged in river drives for more than 30 years. In 1892, a newspaper article mentioned that Prescott and Van Ness had 8 million feet of logs in a boom at Davenport Bridge in the Luckiamute. Other means of log transportation were to build a homemade locomotive, namely putting a steam engine on a cart on wheels on a narrow gauge track and using it to haul logs. So here's a view of Peleg Durgan's log dump in the 1880s, where the small locomotive, this homemade steam machine, has been used to bring the logs on a cart out of the woods down to a log dump, where they were then rolled and dumped into water, water being the easiest means of getting logs to a sawmill. Once the logs were in the water, they were dogged together, or they were moved by a rope or a cable that ran through these metal eyes or dogs, and the logs could be encircled in boomsticks or just dogged together and dragged by a steamboat or tugboat to the sawmill. Another means of log transportation was the use of a flume. Most flumes for log moving were dry flumes. So when a log was placed in this chute, as it headed downhill by force of gravity, it literally would catch on fire. The bark through the friction would all start to smoke. The log dump on the right is the great Pokegama log dump down on the Klamath River, where the sugar pines were dropped from the high plateau above down to the river to take to the mill at Hornbrook, California. There was a massive log flume on the Luckiamute at CK. It was 3,000 feet long. It had a drop of 1,000 feet in elevation. And in 1922, more than 10 million feet of logs that came down this flume were splashed out of CK Dam on the upper Luckiamute River. To get the logs to the flume, the crews had a donkey engine way up on top of the ridge, and they pull the logs up from Rittner Creek and the Luckiamute to the top, and then drop them down through the flume into the reservoir pond behind CK Dam. This is a picture of the steam boiler at the donkey engine that operated the winch that brought the logs up from Rittner Creek. Another aspect of logging in the Luckiamute and other watersheds was the presence of a logging camp. Most times the scene or setting of logging was too remote for the crew to live at home. Consequently, they lived at least during the week and sometimes for several weeks each logging season at a temporary camp in the woods. Women were there as well. They were the cooks and dishwashers. They provided the support assistance for the men engaged in logging. Even when railroads penetrated the Luckiamute, there were logging camps. The logging camps might be moved from one site to another on rail cars, but it was necessary for the logging crew to stay close to work since their labors were really two moonlight or two rides in darkness and a picnic lunch. Namely, they started out at daybreak, they had lunch in the woods, and they got back at dark to the logging camp. Almost everywhere by the end of the 19th century, steam engines were at use in logging. And the primary logging steam engine was developed at Eureka, California by John Dolbear and his partner, William Carson of the Dolbear and Carson Lumber Company. As you can see, the house at the right suggests that William Carson made a bundle of money as a logger. The Carson Mansion in Eureka is one of the grand examples of Queen Anne architecture that stands on the West Coast. The patent drawing on the left is what John Dolbear sketched in 1881, where he placed a steam boiler and a winch on a sled with a steam engine to yard logs. So in this view, we can see two of these Dolbear steam donkeys at work in the woods. And here's a close-up view of the big winch with the wire cable and the steam boiler that would be used to yard the logs across the floor of the forest to get them out for sawing or milling. A very important adjunct to all of this was the manufacture of wire rope or cable. And there were a number of manufacturing companies, such as the Mallory Company in Portland, Oregon, that provided this kind of technology. So logging touches on inventiveness, patents, manufacturing, and production of heavy equipment to get the logs out of the forest to the sawmill. Wire rope or cable was also used for building bridges. This bridge I remember well. My father constructed it, and you can see that there is a railing on the right, a single strand of cable fastened at only 3 or 4 places to the deck of the boards that are on the other cables that run across the river. This is a bridge where only one person at a time dare go across, and it's very likely that your feet start to move away from your hands that are hanging on to that little slender cable. But that was part of the way in which the loggers got into a new area to start felling the trees. There were no roads. They had this kind of entry to get to their work location. By the turn of the 20th century, some inventors had used steam tractor technology to make massive machines to haul logs. But these were not widely used in Western Oregon because of the tremendous amount of rain and mud. They simply bogged down. So the use of a best steam tractor was minimal in this environment. However, railroads became very important in logging. The primary one through the upper part of the Luckiamute watershed was the Valley and Siletz Railroad. It was supplemented by a rail spur at Valsets, by the Independence and Monmouth Railroad, and other narrow gauge lines that were part of the network out of Monmouth and Independence. The Valley and Siletz operated between 1912 and 1984. And I'm certain that some of you will recognize the names of the stations or stopping points along this route. It hauled a few passengers, a lot of milk cans, and a tremendous amount of logs and lumber from the mill at Kings Valley. These were the whistle stops along the route. They were also points for delivery of mail to people living in Benton and Polk counties. The primary metropolis of the Luckiamute watershed was at Hoskins, or Old Fort Hoskins, which had been built by the U.S. Army in the 1850s to keep the Indians from leaving the coast reservation over at Siletz Agency. Hoskins had a sawmill, several railroad shops, and a store and post office. The metropolis of the Luckiamute watershed was actually across the crest of the Coast Range in the Upper Siletz watershed, and that was the logging town of Valsets. It provided a lot of timber that was processed in the Willamette Valley rather than going down the Siletz River to mills on Siletz Bay. The Valsets timber moved east. Yet another means of moving timber out of the woods was through the construction of a splash dam. This is one of the first of two built in Oregon in the 1880s by Charles Granholm and Jordan Shapers. These dams were constructed on the North Fork of the Coos River down on the southwestern coast of Oregon. And you'll notice that the face of the dam appears to be a whole medley of randomly spaced boards. More about that in a moment. The dam itself was constructed of a massive log crib. This was a permanent investment that cost a lot of money and a tremendous amount of energy to construct. The logs were felled and yarded into place and bolted and fastened together to create the framework for a dam. The upstream face of the dam was then planked, if possible, to close off the flow of the river. And usually there were one or two spill gates, in this instance, vertical lift spill gates, to spill water, or actually to open the dam to spill a lot of water and then open a boom and release the logs to go surging down the stream. So here's a splash dam just in the process of being opened. The vertical gate on the left has been raised and the water is starting to flow out of the face of the dam. This dam, the lower dam on the South Fork of Coos River in southwestern Oregon, had a face that was made of massive timbers. These timbers hung on a cable and were set inside an angle iron at the base of the spill gate. To open the dam, the loggers would use a peavey, that device invented by Joseph Peavey, and jam it into the timber and pry down on it, and that would lift it up just enough so that it would be kicked out from the angle iron at the base of the spill gate, and it would float on that cable, and the logs would then rush through the dam, banging against these timbers. So here is the dam opened. The timbers are dangling in the rush of water, and that wild medley of logs, sometimes as much as 3 million board feet in a single opening of the dam, are starting to make their dash 12 miles down to tidewater. Here's a little calmer view when the water has dropped a bit in the reservoir behind, but you can see the steady flow of logs, some of them 50, 40, 60, even 70 feet long, that have been stowed in the boom behind the dam before it has been opened. An artifact from the past, a photograph from 1948 of my father, my next younger brother, myself, and Keith Elliott on the deck of the dam that we were just watching being opened. I suppose I'm one of the few people alive today, maybe the last one in Oregon, who helped splash a dam. I used to go with my father when I was a teenager to open the dams for water release, not release of logs, but to let down the water in the reservoir. The largest of all splash dams built in Oregon was constructed in 1942 on the South Fork of Coos River. And you can see the virgin forest surrounding this site. There were no roads. World War II was underway. And this crew of men standing up on top of the deck of the dam have carried in their groceries on a pack frame. They would carry in groceries for a week. And they were starting to put these massive logs on end, setting them into a trench that they blasted out of bedrock to anchor the dam. Now, how did they lift those logs? My father and his crew, he was the superintendent, used a steam donkey engine on a sled. And they put it in the bed of the river and they winched it for 23 miles up the bed of the river, fastening onto trees and boulders until they got the steam donkey to the location of this dam. And if you look up to the right, in the photograph on the right, there's a very dark feature on the bluff about 40 feet above the dam. That is where they positioned the steam donkey up on top. And it was used then to lift the logs to frame the dam and then eventually to open it. This dam had two massive 30-foot, square-foot gates that were opened by cables running through pulleys powered by the steam donkey engine. And when those gates would open, the water would start to spill, and then the logs would flow from the reservoir behind through the spill gate and go surging downstream. So here's the dam when it is full. It's my father out on the deck, a photo I took when I was in high school. And here's the splash underway. So here are the logs going right through the open gates that have been opened by the donkey engine that's up on the bluff behind the two men on the far left side of this view. And downstream, this is what the splash looked like, a rise of level of the river of 10 to 15 feet and a tremendous surge of uncontrolled logs that were headed 23 miles downstream, going through the lower dam that would also be opened when this splash would arrive to go all the way to tidewater. Sometimes the log drives would jam. And that was a really terrible moment because the crew would try to release the jam. And the most common way was for the men to go out on the jam with the water surging all around them and set a charge of dynamite to blow out what they thought would be the key log. This was perilous work. My father was setting a charge of dynamite when one of the jams broke. He and another man were carried downstream nearly a mile. They were riding on the logs in their cork boots. Glenn Thornton was killed when he fell from a log and another one smashed him. My father dove in behind a rock and barely escaped death from being crushed to death in the log drive. The Luckiamute had a few dams, perhaps 4, maybe 7. At a site called Camp Walker, there's mention of 2 dams. There's identification of a dam called Big Dam that was operating between 1900 and 1903. CK Dam was built in 1905, and it appears in the photograph in this image. And there was a Simpson Dam at Rittner Creek. There were also 3 major booms: the Tetherow boom that caught logs at the junction with the North Fork, and 2 booms at the mouth of the Luckiamute to catch the logs before they ran into the Willamette River. On the left is Simpson Splash Dam on the Luckiamute. It has 2 spill gates. And on the right is a photograph of the pond on Rittner Creek where logs were stored before they could be released to go downstream in a river drive. W.C. France, author of Timber Up the Luckiamute, put it this way. On the log drives, they would fill the pond with logs during the spring and summer operation. When the first heavy rains came in the fall, they would open the gates on the dam and sluice the logs down the river. This was quite an operation because the men that did this, that did this work couldn't be greenhorns. They had to know what they were doing. The log drives kept the river open and the water ran faster. I think it was much cleaner than it is now. You didn't have stagnant ponds. There is a considerable amount of what I believe is misinformation. The Salem BLM district in 1998 wrote, there were approximately 180 to 220 splash dams constructed in the analysis area. 80 to 100 dams operated on the Luckiamute, 40 to 50 on Rickyall Creek, 70 on Mill Creek. I'm sorry, that just isn't true. There was not that much capital to invest in dams. I think what has happened here is a confusion between log drives and artificial freshets created by log dams. And the Watershed Council, as recently as 2004, perpetuated this, what I would call myth, that there were 80 to 100 splash dams on the Luckiamute. So a little revisionist history is suggested. Log drives. Log drives occurred many times on the Luckiamute. Here, the PD Lumber Company took advantage of a big waterfall over the weekend, closed the mill, and put a large crew of men on the river. Rittner Creek has to have extra supply of water to bring the logs down, and this is likely to be the last high water this spring. So there was a log drive in April of 1929. Splashing impacts. And for the Watershed Council, I think these are really important to consider. Splashing using the artificial freshet system with the dam created a flash flood. It brought about erosion of stream banks. It fostered the destruction of spawning gravels. It washed out docks and wharfs. It left stranded logs in fields and along the bottom of the river. It often clogged the river bank to bank with logs, sometimes for more than a year. It led to efforts to channelize the river by blasting and other means. And above all, it was very hazardous labor for the crews engaged in the river drives. Once the logs reached the end of the line, namely the Willamette River or tidewater, they needed to be rafted into log rafts to be hauled by a steam tug to the sawmill. So this is a rafting operation. And you'll notice that in the center, up on the bank, is a donkey engine that was in readiness to help yard a log into position if that needed to be done. Among the principal log drivers on the Luckiamute were the employees or contract laborers of the Independence Lumber Company that operated starting in 1893 in Independence. John Phi Simpson, Dave Simpson, and Fane Albert Simpson were 3 of the 5 Simpson brothers who were involved in log driving. They were the most consistent operators of the log drives and splash dams on the Luckiamute. Their family had a store in Airlie. It was a country store and post office, and it supplied foodstuffs for the men in the logging camps. 1916. The camp of the Simpson brothers on the Luckiamute is in operation, bringing out timber for the supply of the Spalding mill next winter. The logs are being stored in a huge pond, and after fall rains have started, will be floated down the Luckiamute to its mouth and then towed down the Willamette to Salem by boat. It's estimated this camp will have 6 million feet of timber ready by the time the rainy season begins. Charles Kent Spalding is a now largely forgotten, but once prominent Oregon lumberman. He was born in Yamhill County and grew up on a farm west of Newburgh in the 1870s. He eventually turned to lumbering and built a handsome home on the left that yet stands in Newburgh, and a grand arts and crafts bungalow next door to his chief financial officer on what is now part of the campus of Willamette University in Salem. So he had 2 homes, and he kept those throughout his lifetime, one in Newburgh and one in Salem. Spalding Lumber Company was a diverse operation. It involved logging, log transport, and manufacturing. Its specialty was the production of the patented Indiana silo. And here we see on the left a display ad for Charles K. Spalding Logging Company featuring the Indiana silo. Spalding products and facilities included a sash and door factory in Salem, a pulp and paper mill at the mouth of Pringle Creek in Salem, dimensional lumber mills in Newburgh, Salem, and Independence, silo manufacturing in Salem for shipment of silo parts all over the United States, and a sash door and furniture factory in McMinnville. So Spalding needed a lot of timber. In this 1910 article, we see that J.R. Metzger and assistants have just completed clearing the Santiam from Cascadia to Waterloo, and will begin driving out 8 million feet of logs to Salem for Spalding. Mr. Metzger in the job used 2 tons of powder, fixing the rocks so the logs can pass. In other words, they were blasting channels in the river, and all the old debris was cleaned out. There were suckers galore along the river, namely lamprey, but only 2 trout were seen killed by the explosions. This is an important enterprise for that section. So as you can tell, no concern about the environment, no concern about the fisheries, but a very important economic enterprise for Spalding Lumber Company. The river drives continued for Spalding on several streams. They were run on the Luckiamute from the 1890s to the 1920s. One drive on the North Santiam with 30 men brought out 10 million feet in 1911. They also did log drives on Little Rickrell Creek, as well as the North Yamhill River. Not all of this was uncontested. John P. Logan had established in the 1860s a grist mill at Kings Valley. He did not like the operations of Simpson Logging Company and Spalding Logging Company. He sued them in 1915, and the court found that the defendants shall refrain from abnormally or artificially increasing the flow of water in the South Fork of the Luckiamute River, and from suddenly or at once releasing the water of any considerable portion of the water in either of the dams aforesaid, and from driving the said logs of the defendant down the South Fork of the Luckiamute River, except under normal and natural flow of the water therein. So this suggests that in 1915, there were probably 2 dams on the Luckiamute, and they were having serious impact on Logan's grist mill and small power dam in Kings Valley. The Valley and Siletz Railroad also sued. They sued the Simpson brothers, who were doing the river transport, and the court required them in the future to post a $5,000 bond in case there were any damages to the railroad bridges or grades or right-of-way because of the artificial freshets in the Luckiamute River. The target for Spalding's operations was downtown Salem, where the carousel is presently located on the waterfront near the mouth of Pringle Creek. That is the view on the left. The Marion County Courthouse, original one, stands boldly about 4 blocks back from the river. Spalding had 2 stern wheelers that pulled the log booms from the mouth of the Luckiamute downstream past Independence to the pulp mill, sash and door factory, and sawmill on the waterfront in Salem. Some may remember that was later the site of the Boise Cascade pulp mill, which is now also long gone. So in 1917, the Oregon legislature decided to regularize the operation of splash dams. The Oregon Public Utility Commission was to hold hearings and issue a franchise to drive logs on what were deemed to be navigable rivers. There had to be an application made to justify the franchise, and the Log Boom Act was operative until 1957. So immediately, Spalding Lumber Company went to the Public Utility Commission to get a franchise for splash dams on the Luckiamute. And the Public Service Commission, today Oregon's Public Utility Commission, issued that franchise. And almost immediately, John P. Logan sued again. And the Polk County Court held that the Log Boom Act of 1917 was invalid. The case was so contested that the Logan matter against Spalding Logging Company went to the Oregon Supreme Court in 1920. And the Supreme Court looked at the damages that Logan had suffered. Judge Belt had issued an injunction against Spalding to use the Log Boom Act. He declared that the act was unconstitutional because only a county or city council could grant a franchise, not a state commission. But the Supreme Court rejected Judge Belt's observation and modified the order to limit the operation of splash dams on the Luckiamute so that they should not work any injury to the rights of the riparian owner. So in other words, Spalding retained the franchise, but it was subject to any damages to Logan or other riparian property owners if there were problems caused by log drives on the Luckiamute. Interestingly, just at the time that this litigation was going on, there was a breakthrough in log transportation, and that was the advent of high lead logging in the 1920s. The use of cables and a spar pole to get the logs up off the ground and eventually onto a truck. So a very brave generation of loggers became high climbers. They would climb the tree, cut out the top, and then they would pass up the blocks and cables to set the rigging on this giant spar pole. This was extremely hazardous work, but it greatly accelerated the removal of logs from the forest to the sawmills. And this coincided with the development of heavy-duty log trucks to haul on logging roads. I urge you to look at the condition of the logging road on the right. There are no grades, there are no culverts, there's no care at all about the environment. This was the era of getting out the cut, and consequently, the environment suffered greatly, particularly accelerating erosion and flow of eroded materials in the stream courses. My father was also involved in this. His crew built this bridge when the log trucks became available after World War II. They were still using splash dams to get out the timber, but truck hauling became very practical with caterpillars to build roads and construction of these logging bridges back in the mountains. Another very important player in the Luckiamute watershed was George Gerlinger. He started out as a logger in Washington, and then in 1905, in partnership with Henry Pittock and Ledbetter, his son-in-law, Pittock's son-in-law, they founded the Willamette Valley Lumber Company. In 1906, they built a railroad to Falls City. In 1912, George Gerlinger joined his brother Louis to establish the Gerlinger Motor Car Company. Eventually, the Gerlingers Willamette Valley Lumber Company became Willamette Industries. By 1999, it had 14,000 employees. And then in 2002, there was the hostile takeover by Weyerhaeuser Corporation, and the heirs of Gerlinger, the Swindell family, and others were bought out for $7.6 billion. George Gerlinger's fortune was made primarily in Polk and Benton counties. And on the left, we see the Gerlinger Motor Company's Gersick. This was their first log truck. And the successor company today is Kenworth, the manufacturer of heavy trucks that are in use all over the United States and many other parts of the world. There was a direct descent of corporate ownership from Gerlinger Motor Company to Kenworth. Another cousin, Carl F. Gerlinger, also from Alsace in eastern France, established the Dallas Machine and Motor Works and the Salem Iron Works. Carl was an inventor, and he patented a log moving device called a heister or hydraulic lift machine. And these are still manufactured by Gerlinger Corporation today. They are widely used in movement of forest products once they have been milled. Splash dams and log drives were widely used in Western Oregon. On the view on the left, we can see the many different streams that had dams. There's a little bit closer up view on the right of the proposed or historically documented dam locations in northwestern Oregon, both in the Willamette Valley, on small streams like Silver Creek and the Pudding River, as well as on the North Yamhill and the Luckiamute. Log drives interrupted the flow of water in a river. Rebecca Miller, a hydrologist at Oregon State, has identified this as disruption of a sustained pulse, or it's a sustained pulse disturbance, and that this happened on many streams because of splash dams between 1880 and the termination of splash dam logging in 1956. Well, splash dam logging caused a lot of disruption in stream beds. Many times crews would go in with a caterpillar, for example, and channelize the river to improve the log transportation. This had great impact on lamprey and salmon who would frequent those streams. The runs of both lamprey and salmon were significantly diminished as a direct consequence of log drives, splash dam logging, and forest logging practices. The end of splash dams and river drives came for many reasons. One, there was the development of high lead logging with yarders and log trucks to move the logs. Second was the end to the emergency demand for forest products because of World War II. Third was mounting opposition by environmental advocates, especially the Isaac Walton League, that wanted to protect fish habitat and fish runs. Fourth, there was general and consistent opposition from riparian property owners who suffered damages and erosion from these artificial freshets and log drives. And fifth, after World War II, there was an increasing use of river recreation and outdoor activities, and there were great dangers in these artificial freshets surging out of splash dams or during log drives. So in 1957, the last of the dams operating in the Pacific Northwest, the Great Tioga Dam on the South Fork of the Coos River, was burned, and that ended an important and memorable era in log transportation in this region. Rebecca Miller, who's written about the hydrology of splash dams in 2010, observed, streams affected by splash damming experienced a profound flood disturbance regime shift. Splash dam flood regimes occurred for nearly 40 years on some systems, creating more frequent and greater magnitude floods. The higher magnitude splash dam freshets had a greater capacity to transport bedload and reportedly left behind little in-channel substrate and stream complexity. In other words, the splash dams literally scoured the bottom out of the river. So again, the long-term impacts: abrupt, calamitous disruption of normal stream flows, erosion of stream banks and downstream soil deposition, washing out of spawning gravels and deep pools, destruction of holding grounds in streams and meander courses, washout of woody debris, log, and shade materials, so important for temperature maintenance, extensive exposure of bedrock and consequent high temperatures, and reduced macroinvertebrates, the foodstuff of fish and small fry in those stream courses. For those of you who would like to read more, I recommend my father's book, Swift Flows the River. That was published back in 1990. And also, I consulted for this presentation the BLM report on Rowell Creek, Mill Creek, Rick Riel, Luckiamute, W.C. Francis, Timber Up the Luckiamute, the Ash and Luckiamute Watershed Studies, Rebecca Miller's thesis at Oregon State, and Stephen Mosier and J.E. Farnell's Luckiamute Navigability Study of 1981. Those were the primary sources of information, as well as a very extensive research in contemporary newspapers. So here are my acknowledgments on the photographs. And on the right is my father. In 1928, he was walking home from college from Ashland to Bandon, Oregon, by way of the canyon of the Rogue River, a trek that we celebrated 40 years later with my dad and my brothers to retrace that wonderful journey. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I can't say how fascinating your presentation was. That was really incredible, and I want to say that as in all of our Citizen Science presentations, you know, we learn as much as anyone else in many different ways, and I really appreciate you calling out some of the information that we may have received and not understood fully, or didn't have the full story, and we'll look forward to correcting that as needed. So thank you very much for bringing that up.
That's very positive. I'm sorry to be critical, but I know how much energy and capital went into construction of a dam.
Mm-hmm.
And consequently, I think probably the Luckiamute never had more than 6 or 7 dams in its entire course.
Yeah, so in that one picture where you show the the lines that showed where the splash dams were, it looked like the Luckiamute was riddled with those red lines, so marking off locations of splash dams. So are you saying that those are probably log drives rather than physical splash dams?
Well, it's interesting. I don't want to fault Rebecca Miller. She did a great job on her thesis, but she didn't provide any documentation to pinpoint the dams on the Luckiamute. And I combed every newspaper I could get my hands on and came up with no more than 4 or 5 dams on the Luckiamute. So I think the number needs to be revised significantly. And what we're really seeing are annual log drives. And there could have been more than one drive in a year. Mm-hmm. Anytime there's a surge of freshet or runoff, they can open a boom and drive out logs. And the catch booms down at the mouth of the river are certainly capable of catching the logs before they go into the Willamette.
Yeah, definitely more to learn and more to study about this. But with that, I want to open it up to questions and allow Kendra to check in with the Q&A. We're getting some questions in, so go for it, Kendra.
Yeah, we are. I'll start with just a comment from one of our participants. She said that her family owned the last home site, or owns the last home site in Hoskins on the road up to Valsette's. My mother was on the river one day with two of her very young grandchildren, late 70s or early 80s. She heard a roar, quickly gathered up the kids to high ground, only to see a huge wave of water rushing through the property. This was the day they drained the valley and the Silet's log pond with no warning to her that it would be happening. It was unbelievable. No harm done, no one was sued, but I'm sure there's damage to the riparian zones and gravel beds for fish.
Well, that's right. When Valsette's was raised, the town was basically eliminated. They did drain the big reservoir or holding pond at the mill. And it sounds like she happened to be there on the day that that flood came surging downstream.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right. The next one just says, thank you. That was fascinating. A nice comment there. And then another person is wondering, can you comment on who the primary profiteers from the logging were in this area?
Would you repeat that, please?
Who primarily profited from the logging in this area?
Well, the fortunes that were made were those of the Gerlinger Swindells families through Willamette Valley Lumber Company, or what became Willamette Industries, and the Charles K. Spalding family of Newburgh and Salem. That's where the big money went. Virtually everyone else was hired labor, working in sawmills, in logging camps, in transportation, and there was no big money in that whatsoever. Spalding, I believe, hit on really hard times during the Great Depression. I think he lost most of his fortune, and he died about 1935 or 1936. He's rather a forgotten figure today in Oregon history, but if you look at any land atlas, he owned tremendous amounts of timber in Tillamook, Yamhill, Polk, Benton, and Marion counties. So if you go to an old Metzger's atlas, almost anywhere in a rural area, it will say Charles K. Spalding Lumber Company. There is also some question about his involvement with the Oregon land fraud ring in the acquisition of his timberlands. And for those of you who'd like to pursue that, the book to read is Looters of the Public Domain by Stephen A.D. Pewter, head of the Oregon land fraud ring. And he wrote the book while he was in prison after he was convicted of theft of public lands.
Interesting. All right, and you got another person just saying no question, but a big thank you for a very interesting hour. And then, where could I learn more about the flume near CK? I used to live near there and I hadn't heard of it before. Very interesting.
The account that I consulted is in Franz's Timber Up the Luckiamute. That is about the only source that I know of. And that's where I lifted the picture of the donkey engine up on top of the ridge where they yarded the logs up from Rittner Creek to drop them down that flume. I suppose that there might be some trace of the flume yet on the floor of the forest. It was 3,000 feet long, and there might well yet be an archaeological trace of it at CK.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. That was a really fascinating picture that you had of that. And then the next question is, how successful has remediation been for these streams, establishing good gravel for fish habitat, stabilizing of banks, etc.?
Well, that is a wonderful question. And I'm sorry I'm not a fisheries biologist. I'm a history teacher. However, I know from experience, particularly having spent most of my first 17 years on the South Fork of the Coos River, that the rehabilitation is very slow. The redeposition of spawning gravels and enhancement of the environment, the putting in place of drift or downed logs, improvement of the vegetative corridor for temperature control has been a very gradual process. That particular stream watershed is also very difficult because it's wholly owned by Weyerhaeuser Corporation. It's gated. That entire river system is basically closed to public entry. I've only been in there one time in the last 40 years. I saw a lot of regeneration, but I didn't see a good fishing opportunity. And I know that's been one of the real challenges, particularly that the BLM has taken on, is to try to restore the stream bed in its corridor. And it's a slow go on streams that were heavily splashed.
Suzanne, did you want a chance at all to talk about any of the things that Luckiamute Watershed Council has been doing specifically on the Luckiamute? Or do you want me to move on to the next question and we could swing around to that at another time?
Well, I definitely want to get to allow all the questions to be asked, and I'll mention that, yeah, it does take a long time, you know, in our lifespan, in our organizational time span, you know, we see the effects of splash dams on the creeks that we work on and the you know, the rivers that we work on. And it's yeah, the bedrock, the exposed bedrock, the erosion, the stream banks being perched. And so, yeah, it's a slow process, and putting in that large woody debris and trying to slow that water down and plant trees for the future, conifers that will, in many, many, many years when we're gone, hopefully be able to provide some of those benefits. That's what we do. And we're proud to work with the landowners and everybody, the donors and the partners that make that all possible, including BLM, including, you know, the private landowners and the timber companies as well.
Kendra, can I just insert something here? We've been talking a lot about the negative impacts of splash dams and the Log Boom Act of 1917. There is at least one positive. About 20 years ago, I was the state's witness in a navigability case over the John Day River on the Columbia Plateau. And the smoking gun evidence that I was able to bring to the table was the franchise granted to the Chi Lumber Company to drive logs from Monument to the Columbia River. And they actually did test drives, and I knew the length and dimension of the logs, and that they drove the logs 134 miles downstream. So what happened is that was proof of navigable use, and consequently, where the private property owners attempted to cut off all recreational navigation on the John Day, it's now a public waterway for 134 miles. And it was the franchise to a logging company that helped us prove that. So that's a positive. Offsets a little bit the negatives of the habitat impacts.
Yeah, thank you. That's fascinating. So the next question is, can you tell us a little bit about what it was like as a child on one of those dams and seeing the transitions through your eyes as a child of one of the loggers?
Well, maybe, I guess I thought I was privileged as a child. We lived 14 miles by riverboat from Coos Bay, Oregon. We had a cabin with no electricity. We got off the boat at the little village of Delwood and then hiked a mile through the forest to where we lived. And then my father was working back in the canyons above there. We'd see him once a week when he'd come in to pick up more groceries and spend the weekend with my mother and my next younger brother. For me as a child, those experiences were great adventures. There was a drama about the river drives, the opening of the dam, all of the rush of logs and water, the timing of the opening of the dams in sequence. And a lot of that, of course, was driven by the wartime necessities of World War II and the Korean War. There were a few other franchises granted after 1935, except for those to the Coos River Boom Company in southwestern Oregon. It was clear that this was environmentally a not responsible or an irresponsible way for log transport. But because of the tremendous demand for forest products during World War II, for the housing boom after World War II, and the shipment of all that lumber to Southern California or to California, the state went along with the franchises until 1957, when they revoked the last one. So there was another lesson to be learned. My parents said, "You're not going to work in a sawmill and you're not going to work in the woods. We want you to go to college." So that happened. So my brother David, some of you may know, is an attorney in Albany. Our youngest brother was an engineer who graduated from MIT, and I became a school teacher. So we all went in different directions, and we stayed away from forest products.
That's great. All right, your next one. Steve's father, Dow, told me riveting and interesting stories about splash damming, including the ingenuity of loggers tasked with moving huge logs down waterways and designing techniques to accomplish the task. Guess you're someone here who's spoken to your father before.
I was amazed. My father could invent something. One time they had a boat that sank in the river, and he created a giant electromagnet that lifted the boat up to the surface so that it could get a pump into it to empty it out. Logging required a lot of ingenuity. And that's, I think, why he succeeded so well at the job that he did.
Yeah, sounds like he was quite an engineer himself. All right, another question for you. Have you done research on the history of organized labor and big timber?
I have addressed it obliquely. Historian Bill Robbins at Oregon State, William Robbins, has done that with much more precision and attention, particularly in his book, Hard Times in Paradise. My encounters in research have been with the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, and then with the West Coast Longshoremen's Union that was so militant in the late 1940s, early 1950s under its boss, Harry Bridges, out of San Francisco. But it's not an area of significant publication interest of mine.
All right, and your next question, does there exist an estimate of the average age of the trees that were logged during the time that the splash dams were used?
Yes, I think because these were primarily all old growth, they ranged in years from 100 to maybe 450 to 500 years old. Some of them were absolutely enormous.
All right, thank you. And then another, just thank you for a wonderful and incredible presentation. It's great to have a record of this history. And is it okay, Suzanne, if I say this person's name who knew his father?
Sure.
Okay, this is from Bill Robbins.
Oh.
So he wanted to say also that Dow was also a realist, telling me that splashing logs destroyed all living things in their path. Excellent presentation, Steve.
Well, thank you.
Another wonderful presentation, and thank you to Luckiamute Watershed Council. And then a note here from someone who says that Data Basin Conservation Biology Institute has a splash dam map showing 15 to 20 splash dams on the Luckiamute and one on the Marys. I gather the 15 to 20 is sketchy. How about the single one on the Marys?
I don't know about a dam on Marys River, and I would, I'd be really impressed to see the documentation for 15 on the Luckiamute. That's a pretty significant investment of capital. Maybe so, but I certainly didn't find it in the research I did for this presentation.
Okay. And one more, thank you for this very interesting hour. I've been along several of these rivers from years ago as a child on family outings, climbing on logs and splashing in the water. There was not the concern for fish nor the environmental destruction until years later. Now I consider myself an environmentalist. And again, thank you so much for this presentation. People really, really enjoyed it. And fascinating pictures. Thanks so much. That's for me. I really enjoyed it too. So thank you for all the work you did in researching and pulling all this stuff together for all of us.
And I just want to jump in here and say that there was a question that was put into chat, and I will read it to you since it's from somebody who really wanted to have their question asked. So were there splash dams on the Little Luckiamute above Falls City?
I do not believe so. I didn't find any record of it, but there's still a lot of work to be done. Only a few of the newspapers for the Mid-Willamette Valley are in digital format that affords keyword research. Also, there's somewhere a significant archive of logging and log transportation pictures held by the Simpson heirs, the descendants of the Simpson brothers. And if someone can find those, there's probably a lot more photo documentation on log transportation on the entire Luckiamute River system, both big and little.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Stephen. And I wonder, during the course of preparing for this presentation, was there anything that just shocked you or surprised you? I find that hard to believe that there could be still something that would do that, since you have such a wealth of knowledge and experience. But was there anything?
Well, I just had a great curiosity to learn more about Charles K. Spalding, because his name is all over the place in the land atlases. But biographically, like many timbermen, he was a fairly anonymous, low-profile figure. I think he did serve one term in the Oregon legislature, but he left behind, to my knowledge, no foundation, no significant good works, and yet for a time he was one of the wealthiest shakers and makers in the forest products industry in the northern Willamette Valley. Maybe my expectations are shaped by modern expectations. But I had the fortune of teaching at Lewis and Clark College, where timber money made a lot of my career possible. The investment in higher education by Oregon's lumbering families has been very significant. And for that, I'm appreciative.
Absolutely. Well, we still do have some time for questions. If any one of you would like to throw one up in the Q&A box, we definitely will have time to read it and respond. In the meantime, I don't want to forget to thank our friends of the Luckiamute Watershed Council and our business circle members who make presentations like this possible with support, volunteering and donor support. And so I'm going to name some of those business circle members. We have Starker Forests and Hancock Forest Management, who's now Manulife, but we were really grateful for the support from our friends and partners in the timber industry as well. We have Spiritopia Distillery, we have the Les Schwab tires, and Croft Vineyards, and also La Campiona 880 AM. We're really blessed to have such great partners in this work. So thank you all. And thank you also to all of you who have joined us tonight, and for all of you who are already friends of the Luckiamute Watershed Council and supporters and volunteers. If you'd like to learn more about how you can be a friend of the Luckiamute, you can go to our website, and there will be a quick link right on the home page. We have that up right now, and you can learn more about that and learn more about our Watershed Council as well if you're new to us. There was, yep, I see somebody threw in a question there about, is this going to be sent for us to watch again? And absolutely, that was going to be my next comment. We are recording this, including the question and answer portion. The full presentation will be available to everyone who's registered for this event. So all of you who are attending today, as well as anybody who couldn't attend but registered in advance, you'll all get the link when it's ready. And feel free to share that out. It will be on our YouTube channel as well, and you'll get that email as soon as it's ready. I also want to say that there will be a survey sent out as well after the presentation. Please go ahead and fill that out. It's really quick. I think there's 6 questions, just so that we know better about how we met your expectations and how you, and if you have any suggestions for future topics as well, we were happy to hear that. Oh, another question and answer.
Yeah, this one is I have a copy of Timber Up the Luckiamute. I worked with Pete Franz typesetting it. I'd like to get other copies. Do you know where you can get them?
My recommendation is that you try on Google a site called ABE Books. And if you type in the author or the title of the work, it will lead you to several thousand bookstore inventories across the world. And you might readily pick up Franz's book in that way. I do have a copy. It was my father's.
Yeah, there was one question that came through a while ago, and I think perhaps I missed it. And it was just specifically about the splash dam map of Northwest Oregon that you showed during your presentation, and where a person might be able to find that.
That is available online, and it is in Rebecca Miller's master's thesis from Oregon State University.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, and actually I saw that question and I responded directly. I can share that out. If anyone has trouble finding it, just send me an email, outreach@luckiamutelwc.org, and I will be happy to share that with you.
And my suggestion is to members of the council, if any of you know Rebecca, why don't you quiz her a little bit as to her sources, because she did show 7 or 8 splash dams in her map, and maybe she has specific locations for them.
Absolutely, that's something we will do for sure. Thank you. All right, well, it seems to be that when I'm talking, maybe other questions pop in as I'm talking, so oh, there we go. We have a thank you. A thank you so much for this presentation, and as well as a few more in the chat. So I think everybody's expressing their appreciation right now. And I also want to reiterate how lucky and grateful we feel for you to join us tonight. Stephen, reaching out to you was kind of just something I saw through Rebecca Miller's paper that you were cited, and that spurred a conversation about, well, can we try to reach out to Stephen Dow Beckham and see if he might give a presentation? And you willingly did that, and we're very grateful for that. So thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. It was fun to work on this assignment.
I'm glad. Well, good night, everyone. Again, you'll get that email tomorrow with a link to the presentation, and have a wonderful evening.